What should the minimum drinking age be if we based it on the actual neuroscience? So, as a drug scientist, I think about this question a lot because we have a lot of laws out there that sometimes don't fit with what the science actually says. Now, we have some that do, and I am thankful for those. So, for example, we don't let minors be given the death penalty because we assume that their brains are not fully formed yet. And that same style of thinking works for other things like our drug laws, too. So, around the world, countries have kind of set their own standards for what they think the minimum drinking age should be, as well as things like the minimum age to buy tobacco and weed. In Germany, the drinking age for beer and wine is 16, but the drinking age for spirits is 18. In the United States, our age for drinking and now for using things like nicotine is 21, but both of those used to be lower in some states. There's a perpetual debate going on, especially with things like weed, in terms of making that minimum age of use even later, so something like 25. But what does the science actually say? I commonly hear people say things like the brain stops developing at 25, and that is way too simplistic. So now there are certain areas that finish developing later than others. But a lot of our brain just keeps changing throughout our entire life. So we can actually form new neurons in areas like the hippocampus, which is an area linked to memory, basically throughout our entire life. So in one way, our brain never stops developing. And we have a ton of individual differences too. So for example, what we see is that people with ADHD, their prefrontal cortex typically develops a little bit later. So at earlier ages, it seems like it's delayed by like 3 years. But there's no like one specific stopping point, and different things are developing at different points in time. So about 90% of our brain is fully developed by about the age of 5, which is why things like language development are so important. So giving kids exposure to different sounds, for example, at a very young age, it's more likely that they'll be able to differentiate those sounds later, which means that they're going to be better at other languages. So 0 to 5, super important in terms of brain development. Now, our attention and working memory seems to develop until about the age of 12, in which it plateaus. And then after that, in the early 20s, it starts going downhill from there. Now, impulse control and emotional regulation, that development typically lasts into the early adulthood. So we're talking about early 20s. So that's why you'll actually hear that age 25 going around as like your brain stops growing. No, our prefrontal cortex mostly stops developing at age 25, but it continues a little bit longer than that. So it's not like as soon as you reach midnight on your 25th birthday, your brain is going downhill from there on. No, it is just, it typically increases up until this point, and then it plateaus or goes downhill. And our language ability typically develops into our 30s. And so we see different things when we look at things like the cellular level. So we see that as we age, basically we form a bunch of different new connections. And there's a ton of these when we are young children. But as we keep aging, we learn that we don't need all of those connections. Too many connections can be a problem for your brain too. So this is linked to things like sensory problems. And so we actually prune back some of those connections. We take away some of those connections to get to a place in which we're like, okay, we have the perfect number now, the Goldilocks of neurons. And that typically comes at about age 18 for things like our excitatory connections. Those are things that are like telling your body to activate. But our inhibitory connections, we see a huge growth of those starting around the age of 18 and really kind of stopping around the age of 21. And when it comes to drugs, basically all of those things matter. So we need to look at like patterns of overall brain development, but we also need to be looking at like connections between neurons. And so it seems like the best age, according to neuroscience, to basically allow people to try drugs for themselves is around 18 to 21. So if you start using a drug then, it should not influence your development as much because your development is mostly over. And they've done studies looking at the age that somebody starts using drugs and seeing if it predicts kind of later problems. So overall, they said that if people started using around the age of 18, they were mostly okay. Now, if they started a year later around the age of 19 with things like weed, they were then much less likely to use nicotine. And they also said that people who started using weed only around the age of 21, they were more likely to have kind of good educational achievement. So for example, be able to graduate, which makes sense because a lot of people graduate around the age of 21 and 22 if they are traditional students. Now, this is a correlational study, not causal. So they were not making people start using at a certain age and then seeing what they were later doing. This was tracking people across their lives and finding that later ages correlated to these specific things. And we also have some kind of natural experiments that have occurred with things like the drinking age. So there is a period of time in which certain states had lower drinking ages than others. So for example, about 29 of the states said, nope, we're going to allow people to drink at 18 or 19 versus 21. Now, the US government wanted everybody to increase their drinking age to 21, but they couldn't technically do this because the 21st Amendment said that states were in charge of alcohol in particular. So they basically said, like, okay, we're just going to pass a law that says you're not getting federal funding for your highways if you keep your lower drinking age. And then mysteriously, those states fell in line and increased their drinking age. So we were actually able to track what happened when certain states had lower drinking ages than others. And what we found is that a lower minimum drinking age, so if we let people drink at a younger age, that was linked to increased vehicle crashes as well as increased drinking rates. Now, other people will say, like, okay, but there's this what is called rubber band effect. So you don't allow people to drink until they're 21, and then that band snaps. And then basically they will just drink a ton because they were just being repressed from drinking. But we don't actually see that. We see that fewer people drink if the drinking age is increased, and that decrease in drinking kind of stays over time. Now, we also see this effect with tobacco too. We see that the later that somebody starts using it, the less likely they are to use it in general. And it does seem like that increase from 18 to 21 could be positive to make people not start using nicotine. So somewhere between 18 to 21 seems to make sense. 18 makes sense, 21 can make sense, 25 does not make sense. There's basically no rationale for any sort of switch that flips at age 25. So from a neuroscience perspective, basically every country can keep their drinking age kind of where it is. Good job.